Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back in our episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have a plan to save Social Security or make it worse, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said Senators Bernie Moreno and Elizabeth Warren share a plan to save Social Security in the opinion section of the New York Times, and they quote some stuff from that article. Unless Congress acts, the fund for which most Social Security beneficiaries are paid will be significantly paid by late 2032. After that, Social Security benefits could be cut by more than 20%. Instead of cutting benefits for the retirees who count on Social Security, we need to take bipartisan action to protect those benefits, reward work, and restore fairness. That starts with a common sense solution, lifting the Social Security payroll tax cap. Today, the maximum Social Security withholding for one worker is $22,878, or 12.4% of $184,500, according to one estimate. Eliminating the payroll tax cap would inject around $3 trillion into the program over the next 10 years. Lifting the cap so that all income is treated the same will generate substantial revenue that would extend the solvency of Social Security for another generation. A Washington Post editorial in response, How to Make Social Security Worse, points out the plan doesn't actually solve the problem of government's insolvency. Removing the cap would only close about half of Social Security's funding shortfall, raising its top marginal income tax rates to among the highest in the world, and threatens economic growth. It also questions the wisdom of spending the new revenue on old people in the same way, and it has to quote from that article, and it would just be foolish to raise taxes to be this much and use 100% of the revenue to keep Social Security benefits the same for all seniors. 1/3 of benefits go to people with incomes over $100,000, a program that's supposed to be about keeping seniors out of poverty does not need to be structured this way. It's not worth voting over 5% of the United States' enormous GDP to keep its wealthy seniors off the streets, but that's what the federal government sends on Social Security right now. Do you think Moreno and Warren's plan for lifting the Social Security payroll tax cap is a good idea, or will it make the program worse? And personally, I think, I think libertarian position here, if people want to pay into Social Security, they should be able to, but personally, I think it's just a Ponzi scheme. If an individual non-government actor would run Social Security, it would be 100% considered a Ponzi scheme, and they'd go to jail for it. But since the government does it, it's just the law. And personally, as I said earlier, if people do want to pay into Social Security, I think they should be able to, but I don't think they should be forced to do so if they don't want to. And that's my thoughts. Pretty much every government program. If people want to pay into it, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to if they don't want to. Next, we have lawsuit argues Hawaii's harsh new hemp regulations will stifle competition. From Reason.com, posted by Jaya Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think you shouldn't have regulations on any material. If you want to do whatever you want with hemp, you should be able to. It shouldn't be the government telling you what you can't do with it. Same with every other material. Justify doing whatever you want to, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Next we have, it just goes to show the depth of the cover-up, just how far this goes, posted by Rabat Ascalon, and that's a cross post from the Defund Aid to Israel subreddit, and that looks like a video of Thomas Massie talking about, on the hill near the U.S. Capitol about, defunding aid to Israel. And the OP added that drop sites Julian Edra asked lawmakers on Capitol Hill about a new investigation by drop sites Brian Grimm and Murtaza Hussein, revealing how Jeffrey Epstein and former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak leveraged a private network of Israeli intelligence operatives, including former Mossad chief Danny Yatom, to train specialized Congolese forces during civil wars and gain access to Congo's vast mineral wealth. Lawmakers who were divided on whether Congress had done enough. Some defended the Oversight Committee's work, while others called it an absolute and total joke. Several argued that the Banking, Intelligence, and Foreign Relations Committees should all be investigating Epstein from his financing through J.P. Morgan Chase to his ties to CIA and Mossad. And I'd agree with all that. Personally, I don't think Israel should be giving foreign aid to any country, but if taxpayers want to voluntarily pay foreign aid for countries, I think they should be able to, and that does include Israel, I guess. If taxpayers do want to voluntarily give money to Israel, they should be able to. Personally, I would never give any voluntary money to Israel, especially because it could be going to stuff like training Congolese forces during civil wars to gain access to the Congo's vast mineral wealth, as the OP stated, and that's something that I think is important to remember as well. I think American tax dollars are best spent in America rather than foreign countries. But I know other people might not think that, but I definitely do think that's a broad consensus that I think a lot of people have these days. Trump, for all his faults, did run and win on a campaign on America first, and even though he backed up on that when he got in the White House and it became Israel first, I definitely do think a lot of people do prefer our taxpayer dollars to be spent on America first. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas man gets 30 years in prison for transporting anti-government pamphlets from Reason.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And we talked about this in the last episode. Personally, I don't think he should. It's Reddit's just making. Reddit's just using this guy as an example that the Prairie Land people attacked the Prairie Land facility, but this guy was just broadly associated with them. And they're making it seem like that they're all innocent by comparison because they always find the guy in the group who does the least violent thing, I should say, and try and hold him up as the standard of the whole group, kind of like they did with Kilmar Abrego Garcia when it came to him being sent to prison in El Salvador for all the other violent deportees. But ultimately, I think the libertarian position is the state can justify arresting you for whatever reason. But ultimately, when the in-group's always gonna try and make itself look better. They're not going after. They're not sharing headlines about the people who are firing off guns or fireworks at the immigration facility. They're constantly circle jerking headlines about this guy who's just moving boxes of paper. And you can consider that evidence tampering as well. But of course, they're not going to say that in their headlines because that will go against the in-group good, out-group bad narrative, and that's my thoughts on there. Next, we have, for those seeking to engage with politics or against authoritarianism, here is an organized/planned protest site for those willing to participate or be aware of. And that's linked to findaprotest.info, posted by Wonderful Cake 6079. And yeah, personally, I think if people do want to make a list of all protests, they should be able to. If they want to have their own website of it, I think they should be able to justify doing whatever you want, as long as no one's getting hurt, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, due to the quote-unquote hot weather, the prefecture of Paris has decided unilaterally to ban the consumption of alcohol in the city starting at noon tomorrow and the sale of any alcohol starting at 6 p.m. Friday, June 26th, from prefecturepolice.interior.gouv.fr, posted by Economy Medicine Free 18. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, the state shouldn't be banning the consumption of anything. I personally don't think you should be drinking alcohol in very hot weather because it might be the consequences might be deadly. But ultimately, if you want to justify doing it, you should be able to. Same with selling alcohol in very hot weather. Ultimately, some people are going to make stupid decisions, but the state shouldn't be protecting them from themselves. You have every right to make a stupid decision. If you want to be tweaking out on the street on drugs all day, I personally wouldn't do that, but that's your decision to make, not mine. And that's very much the libertarian position on the matter. Next, we have Your Tax Dollars at Work, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Bond Market subreddit. At this point, I'm just collecting scandals like Pokemon cards, and that looks like a tweet from Mika, our friend, who quote tweeted GOPLs, who tweeted, "Cash bail has been caught funneling millions of people in exchange for personal favors," and then the Mika, our friend, added, "Corruption is so normal in the Trump administration that officials don't even get fired after being exposed for it." And yeah, of course, right, this is just another in-group bad, good out-group bad post, I don't really care for cash bail or the FBI as a whole. Ideally, the libertarian position is we get rid of the FBI completely. But, I'm sure if this was a blue FBI director getting caught having the exact same headline, Reddit would say, "Oh, that's misinformation." This is just blue anon posting, I would say. Reddit, they always say, "Oh, QAnon's so crazy," but they constantly post these blue anon headlines that everyone in the outgroup's Satanist pedophile. And personally, I think they're all probably Satanist pedophiles, but of course Reddit, they only care that the red team is Satanist pedophiles. They don't care at all that the blue team is Satanist pedophiles. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, we will combat foreign taxes by imposing more taxes on companies, posted by Jolly Porcupine, and that looks like a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, who proved numerous European countries have been discussing the imminent implementation of a digital services tax on American companies. Some of these countries are close to actually doing this. Please let the statement serve to represent that any country that imposes such a tax will immediately be 100% tariff on any and all goods sent to the United States of America. This tariff will supersede trade deals made with the country, whether implemented, signed, or not. Additionally, the 100% tariff will be immediately imposed if they proceed. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, we gotta be against all tariffs because, libertarians are against all taxes, and tariffs are simply a tax on imported goods. I personally don't really care for tariffs, whether the U.S. is the one doing them or another country is the one doing them. And yeah, but personally, I think, a lot of Redditors only don't like tariffs because the orange man's doing them. They'd love them if Bernie was the one doing them, and I think that's important to remember labor as well. I definitely do think, you gotta support free trade regardless of how fair or not fair it is. Personally, I think people should buy local. If they want to buy cheaper from foreign countries, they should be able to and not have to pay an extra tax on it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the Senate's failure to rein in Trump on Iran is the part of a long history of Congress abdicating its war powers from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think they should be reining in Trump on Iran. I know Rand Paul caved on it. Personally, I don't really care for that, but I definitely know that if Rand Paul stays too principled on everything, he's probably getting thrown out like Thomas Massey. So I begrudgingly respect his decision to cave on it. But it doesn't really matter. The Senate can or cannot justify to say, oh, Trump shouldn't be doing that. But ultimately, the executive branch is the one who really enforces laws. The Senate and the House are really just there to rubber stamp them. And even if they don't rubber stamp them, the executive branch is really the one in position of enforcing them, so it doesn't really matter if what they do on any given vote, I would say. Next, we have breaking. Texas just approved mandatory Bible readings for 5 million public school students. Here's exactly what kids will be required to read, grade by grade, from PugetPress.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's across posts from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, we shouldn't have required reading in schools. I think, it should be optional, but if they do want to have optional Bible reading, that's fine, but I don't think it should be required. I think the libertarian position is, ultimately, we shouldn't have public schools in the first place, though. Ideally, all schools would be private, and the state wouldn't be controlling them. So if a school wanted to have a Bible readings, it would be able to, and no one would, Brett would probably still care because, they're that militantly atheist. But, ideally, no, you wouldn't say, oh, it's the state enforcing religion on people because all schools would be private. And that's my thoughts there. Next, we have Rent Control from X.com, posted by Economy Medicine Free 18, and that's a tweet from End Wokeness, who tweeted, in 2020, Argentina tried rent control, rental prices soared by over 140%, rental availability dropped to 45%, 2023, President Milei repealed it, rental prices went down by 40%, rental availability soared 112%, Mamdani voters in New York City are about to learn a valuable economics lesson. And yeah, personally, I think rent control goes against the free market. I don't really care too much for landlords and them jacking up the housing prices, but if they want to justify that, they should have every ability to do so. The state shouldn't be telling them what they can and can't charge their tenants, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have insightful podcast from the Cato Institute, posted by Rob Likes to Kayak, and they had to give it a listen. And it's a Cato podcast called Abundance Alliance, and yeah, personally, I really. Not the Cato Institute's decent, but I definitely do think if they, I don't really have too much to say on this one since I'm not going to listen to the podcast, so I'm going to just move on to the next one. Next, we have good riddance to Alligator Alcatraz, a cruel, expensive, and pointless authoritarian stunt from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And I responded to this one on the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. They posted it there too. I said, I think it's interesting how you seem to only post reason. You only seem to post reason articles critical of right authoritarianism. You seem to skip over ones like this one. I linked to an article from Reason, Democratic Socialism remains the link phenomenon. Lisa Avalia Chevalier was reported by wealthy, well-educated elites. That's one of their gay race communists they nominated for the House. And then I linked to another one. Mom Downey got his rent free, his wish. Don't expect New York City housing to be more affordable. And the OP replied to me. They said, Mamdani's bad economic policies are dropping buck compared to what's going on at the federal level. And I personally I think if you want to be libertarian, you gotta criticize authoritarian regardless of where it's coming from. Yes, the federal level isn't good right now. You gotta criticize the state level as well. But of course, Reddit, they're only really have to go after the federal level since the out groups can control that one rather than the in group. They'd never go after Mamdani. If they ever did, they'll praise everything he does, even on so-called libertarian subreddits. And that's important to remember that Reddit's very much a DNC astroturf hellhole and not real life. And that's important to remember. You could be like the OP here and constantly post Orange Man bad articles, but ultimately, I think the libertarian position is you gotta be critical of both sides of authoritarianism, and that's sadly not what Reddit is. It's only critical of Reddit authoritarianism when the in-group takes back power, regardless of who it is. Since that Reddit will suddenly justify all the federal government's authoritarian actions again just because the president has a D next to their name. Next, we have leader of Antifa cell members in North Texas sentenced to 100 years in prison for terrorist attack on ICE facility, posted by Chunky Lover 92, and that's an article from Justice.gov. Office of Public Affairs, leaders of Antifa cell members in North Texas sentenced to 100 years in prison for Texas attack on ICE facility, and the OP added, "I am the president of Antifa. We will avenge our fallen brother, now taking applications." And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Antifa. I think they're a bunch of thugs, pretty much like the Proud Boys or Oath Keepers, and it's pretty much just the left-wing equivalent of those, the left-wing equivalent of the militia movement. And yeah, personally, of course, Reddit's always going to defend Antifa. They'll say, "Oh, you don't like Antifa, that means you're fascist, because Antifa means anti-fascist." In which case I reply, so the Nazis were socialists then, because they called themselves the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party. And I'll say, no, you can't always judge anything by its name, except for Antifa, that you have to judge by its name. Same with North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Of course, some of the real tanky Redditors say, "Oh, it is a Democratic People's Republic," but it just goes to show you that you can't always judge something by its name. Antifa is very much a gang of thugs who I personally don't really care for the prison system, but they probably do deserve to go to prison. But of course, Reddit, they're very much a circle jerk. They'll circle jerk themselves and how right they are. And since Antifa's in group rather than out group, they'll always justify whatever is done under the Antifa label. Next, we have 30-year sentence for transporting zines as a 5-alarm fire for free speech from the Intercept.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross-post from the Less Taken Path News. And yeah, personally, you could also argue that I'm sure if the outgroup was doing it, we've talked about the story like so many times now, but if the outgroup was doing it, Reddit would say, "Oh, it was evidence tampering, and he deserves to go to prison because he was associated with a bunch of thugs who were attacking a building." But since the in-group's doing it, Reddit's trying to deflect as much as possible, and just to show you these people have no principles, only teams. And that's sadly like most people when it comes to politics, though, I would say, like 80 to 90%. Next, we have Peace President France to eliminate country for defending itself against FIFA Peace Prize laureate, and that's by Jerry Porcupine. That's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump. United States aircraft just struck Iranian missile and drone storage locations and coastal radar sites, providing ceasefire agreement again. It is very possible that they will never learn. They're making a point where we are no longer able to be reasonable and will be forced the military to complete the job that we were very successfully started. If that happens, the Islamic Republic of Iran will no longer exist. President DJT. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but Trump and his constant saber rattling, but it doesn't really matter who's in the White House. The U.S. president's going to bomb the Middle East regardless. Biden bombed Iraq and Syria a bunch, but that got swept under the rug. And it just goes to show, the president's really just a figurehead, first and foremost. The real people really running the show, as I say in pretty much every episode, are, deep state military industrial complex, satanic cabal of liberty people, whatever you want to call them. And that's my thoughts there. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.